Next opportunity, I would like to pick up from there with Acts chapter 8, Acts chapter 10, move into the text to talk about the quote-unquote household baptism.
Round one.
Christian baptism is a sign and seal of the work of God in His work of redeeming sinners. In both the Old and the New Covenants, the signs and seal of the covenant of grace are given to households of God's people. In the New Testament, there must be explicit proof of such a radical departure from all of God's covenant dealings with His people. Noah received literally a baptism as he went through the flood. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verses 20 through 22. Here, Noah's households were delivered, but the emphasis clearly was on the faith of Noah. The covenant that is made with Abraham, Genesis chapter 12 and verses 1 through 3, Genesis chapter 15, Genesis chapter 17 and verses 1 through 14. Here the New Testament teaches in Romans and in Colossians that Abraham receives an Old Testament parallel of baptism, which is called circumcision, the Old Testament equivalent of baptism. Notice that it is the sign of not Abraham's faith, but it is the sign of the covenant between me and you and your descendants after you, for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your descendants after you. Genesis 17:7. Notice that it is in that covenant you have the heart of the covenant promise. Verse 8, I will be their God. Genesis 17 and verse 5. It is to many nations, and the heart of that covenant is in you. All the families of the earth will be blessed. It is that covenant that Paul says believers are partakers of in the New Testament. The gospel, Paul says in Galatians 3, was preached to Abraham, just as it is preached to us. Abraham surely believed and was circumcised. As in any mission situation, there would be baptism following belief. But that covenant was with Abraham and his descendants, though they were too young to believe, were also circumcised, receiving the Old Testament equivalent of baptism. And it's important to note, Genesis 18 and verse 19, that circumcision marked out Abraham's family as disciples. Abraham was not to presume grace for his children. God told him, you are commanded to bring up your children after you, that I might bring about all the things that I promised you, that is promised in my covenant. Covenant established in the time of Noah with Noah's family, that the earth might be preserved, with Abraham and with his descendants receiving the sign of circumcision, the Old Testament equivalent to baptism. Moses, covenant with Moses established in the wilderness, Exodus 19 and following and other references. Clearly, children are included. Pharaoh would have let the adults go, but Moses insisted the children go with them. And when that covenant at Sinai was made, it was not only made with Moses and with adults, but with the children as well. And this is, incidentally, a very clear example of infant baptism in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 2. All our fathers, remarkable statement, converted Gentiles who can look to the covenant people of the Old Testament and call them our fathers. All our fathers baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And that surely did include infants. My colleague here and my opponent in this debate has referred to the prophecies of Pentecost, or rather to Pentecost itself, and has sought to use that as an example of only the fact that only those who are old enough to believe in the Lord can be baptized. And I would submit to you that, at least for my own, as I had studied this, what became apparent to me as I began to study this many, many years ago, is that reference, the promise is to you and to your children, and to as many as the Lord our God will call to Himself. That number one, that as many as the Lord our God will call to Himself is probably a reference to the as many as you and your children as the Lord our God will call to Himself. And on what basis do I say that? Isaiah 44 and verses 3 and 4, these prophecies of the Spirit to come in the new covenant. For I will pour water on him who is thirsty and floods on the dry ground. I will pour my Spirit, what would come on the beginning of the day of Pentecost, on your descendants, and my blessing on your offspring. Inherent in the new covenant, as it is inaugurated on the day of Pentecost, is a promise that is to you and to your children, which is exactly why Peter would quote this. Isaiah 59 and verse 21, As for me, says the Lord, this is my covenant with them. My Spirit who is upon you, what would have its initial fulfillment on the day of Pentecost, and my words which I put in your mouth, shall not depart from your mouth, nor from the mouth of your descendants, nor from the mouth of your descendants' descendants, says the Lord, from this time forth and forevermore. So I say again, even these Old Testament promises of a glorious new covenant to come are promises and prophecies that specifically include whole households. And I say again, it is the burden of my opponent in this debate to prove conclusively that that household principle is abrogated, and to do it against the fact that very clearly there are whole households baptized where there's only a reference to the faith of the head of that home.
I'm coming in hot.